The courtroom was filled with tension as people whispered among themselves. It wasn't an ordinary trial. Today's case was one that had attracted a lot of attention. A rich, powerful defendant, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, sat confidently at the front. He was used to getting what he wanted, and he felt untouchable in that moment. His arrogance was clear in the way he carried himself. He didn't care about the rules of respect, not even for the judge. As the judge, a black woman with years of experience in the legal system, walked into the room, something unusual happened. Normally, everyone in the courtroom would stand when the judge entered as a sign of respect. But the defendant didn't move. He stayed seated, his eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending as though nothing had changed. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at him, shocked. Some looked at the defendant with confusion, while others shook their heads in disbelief. How could he be so disrespectful? This was no ordinary man on trial. This was someone who had power, wealth, and influence. He had never known a life where he had to worry about the rules that others followed. For him, standing for the judge seemed like a small thing, something he didn't have to do. The judge paused at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room. Her face was calm, but there was something in her gaze that told everyone she wasn't someone to be underestimated. She knew exactly what had just happened. The defendant's refusal to stand was a clear sign of disrespect, but she didn't react immediately. She simply walked to her seat and sat down, her eyes never leaving the defendant. The defendant, still with a smug look on his face, finally turned his head to look at the judge. He didn't seem bothered by what had just happened. If anything, he seemed amused. In his mind, he was above everyone in that room. The law, the people, and even the judge were all beneath him. His money, his power, these things gave him the confidence to act however he wanted. The judge took a deep breath. The courtroom was quiet now, waiting for her next move. Some of the people in the room wondered if she would say something. Would she call out the defendant for his rude behavior? Would she punish him right away? Others simply waited to see how she would handle this unexpected challenge. But the judge didn't speak right away. She sat in her chair, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, as if she were giving the defendant a chance to realize the mistake he had made. She let the silence grow, making it even more uncomfortable for the man who had thought he could do whatever he wanted. The defendant, still leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, felt the eyes of everyone on him. But he didn't care. In his world, people like him didn't follow the rules. Rules were for the weak, for the ones who didn't have the power to make their own way. He had gotten away with everything his entire life. What was one small thing like standing up for a judge? The judge finally spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but strong, carrying authority that couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, addressing the defendant by his last name, "I expect respect in my courtroom. You may have money, but that does not give you the right to disrespect me or anyone else in this room." For a moment, the defendant seemed caught off guard. He had expected her to back down, to let him get away with his arrogance. But the judge wasn't backing down. The power dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just any judge. She had earned her place through years of hard work and dedication. She wasn't someone who could be pushed around. The defendant, now feeling a small flicker of discomfort, tried to brush it off. "Your Honor," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I'm just here to get this over with. I have better things to do than to play these little games." The judge raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond to his comment. Instead, she glanced at the court clerk and gave a slight nod. The trial was about to begin, but everyone could feel that something bigger was happening. This wasn't just about a case anymore. It was about respect, power, and what happens when someone believes they are above the law. The defendant's arrogance had already set the stage for a battle. He had made it clear that he didn't see the judge as an authority figure, just another obstacle in his way. But the judge had made her position clear as well. She wouldn't let his wealth or status influence the way things would go in her courtroom. The next steps in the trial would show just how far this rich defendant's arrogance could take him. As the trial continued, People watched, waiting for what would happen next. Would the judge make an example out of him? Would she allow him to get away with his behavior? The tension was building. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the defendant would finally realize that his money and arrogance couldn't save him from the law. The first part of the trial was over, but the real drama was just beginning. The courtroom was on edge, wondering what the judge's next move would be. Would she let his disrespect slide, or would she take a stand that would change everything? The room was silent after the defendant's rude gesture. Everyone waited, unsure of what would happen next. The defendant, sitting comfortably in his seat, still didn't seem to realize the seriousness of the situation. He glanced at the judge, expecting her to say something, but her eyes remained fixed on him. She wasn't angry, but there was something in her stare that made the entire courtroom uneasy. The judge, a woman who had worked hard to get to where she was, knew that respect was the foundation of the court. She had earned her place through dedication, but today she was being tested. Her calm expression said it all. She wouldn't let the defendant's arrogance go unchecked, but she wouldn't rush into an angry outburst either. Her silence made the moment even more powerful. For a few long seconds, no one in the room dared to speak. The defendant shifted in his seat, still feeling a sense of superiority. He couldn't understand why the judge hadn't reacted immediately. He expected her to back down, to show weakness, but she didn't. She just sat there, her hands folded on the desk, looking at him with steady eyes. The tension was thick in the air. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The defendant was used to getting what he wanted, using his wealth and status to control people. But now, there was something different. The judge wasn't afraid of him. In fact, she seemed completely unfazed by his disrespect. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally broke the silence. Her voice was calm, but full of authority. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, using his last name in a way that commanded attention. "This courtroom is not a place for arrogance. I expect respect for the law, and for everyone in it." The defendant's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He hadn't expected the judge to respond so firmly. He thought she would be intimidated by his wealth, but instead, she was showing him that the law was above all else. He tried to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that the judge was not going to let him walk all over her. "Your Honor," the defendant said, trying to sound calm and collected, "I'm just here to handle this case and move on with my life. I don't have time for all this drama." The judge didn't respond to his comment right away. She simply nodded, as if considering his words. Then she spoke again. "You may think you can avoid the rules because of your status, but here, everyone is equal. The law does not care about wealth. It cares about justice." The defendant's expression darkened slightly. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. The room was still, with all eyes on him, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. Would he continue to challenge the judge, or would he back down? The judge stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the defendant. "I will not tolerate disrespect in my courtroom. You will follow the rules, or there will be consequences." Her words were firm, but there was no hint of anger in her voice. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She was simply setting a boundary. The defendant, who had thought he could control the situation, was now faced with a choice. He could either humble himself and respect the judge, or he could keep pushing and face the consequences of his actions. For the first time, the defendant seemed unsure. The arrogance that had defined him was beginning to slip away. The judge had made it clear. She wouldn't tolerate disrespect. The real question was, would the defendant continue to test her, or would he realize that his wealth and power didn't give him the right to disrespect the law? The silence in the courtroom continued, and everyone could sense that something was about to happen. The defendant had pushed the judge, but now it was her turn to respond. Would she deliver a verdict that would make him regret his actions, or would she let him go, allowing his arrogance to continue unchecked? The audience in the room waited, holding their breath. The trial was far from over, But this moment had already set the tone for what was to come. The judge had shown her strength and authority. Now, the defendant would have to decide if he was going to respect her power or if he would keep challenging her and face the consequences. The courtroom was tense, everyone waiting for the next move. The defendant, still sitting arrogantly, had tried to brush off the judge's warning, but it was clear that he hadn't expected her to stand her ground. For a moment, he wondered if he could still control the situation, but something in the air told him this wasn't going to be like the others. The judge gave him a long, steady look. She was not someone who backed down, no matter how much power or money someone had. She had seen people like him before, rich and entitled, believing that they could escape the consequences of their actions. But she had also seen justice prevail, and she wouldn't let him disrespect her or the law. Then, without warning, the judge spoke again, her voice calm yet firm. "Mr. Hamilton, you've shown disrespect to this court, and I will not ignore it. But I also believe that everyone, no matter their mistakes, deserves a chance to learn. The question is, will you?" The words were simple, but they struck the defendant like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't sure how to respond. His arrogance had been his shield up until now, but it was slowly crumbling. The judge was right. He had been testing her, but now he wasn't so sure of himself. He had expected the judge to act out of anger, to make a quick decision, but she hadn't done that. She was calm, measured, and in control. It made him uneasy. The room fell silent again as everyone waited for the judge to continue. The defendant looked around, wondering if anyone in the courtroom shared his discomfort, but no one dared to speak. Everyone was focused on the judge, waiting for her to deliver her next words. What would she do next? The judge's voice broke the silence again, this time with more authority. "This trial is about more than your actions, Mr. Hamilton. It's about justice, and you will learn that no one is above the law." The defendant's face turned pale. His mouth went dry. He had expected a simple trial, a quick decision that would let him walk out of the courtroom unscathed. But the judge had just made it clear that this would not be a normal trial. She wasn't going to let his wealth and status shield him from what he deserved. The judge stood up, her eyes never leaving the defendant. She spoke directly to the jury and the people in the courtroom. "I will make a ruling that reflects the seriousness of Mr. Hamilton's behavior. This is not just about a mistake he made in my courtroom. This is about teaching a lesson, about what happens when someone believes they are above the law." The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had never been in a position like this before. People had always treated him with respect because of his money and power, but here, in this courtroom, none of that mattered. The law was the only thing that held weight, and it was starting to feel like he was about to experience something he had never imagined. The judge paused, letting her words sink in. "Mr. Hamilton, I hope you realize that this trial is not just a chance for you to escape your mistakes. It's an opportunity for you to understand that power and wealth do not give you the right to disrespect others. I will not tolerate it." Everyone in the courtroom was watching him now, waiting for his reaction. The defendant, who had once seemed so sure of himself, was now visibly shaken. He had pushed too far, and it was clear he didn't know how to get out of it. His arrogance had finally caught up with him. The judge turned her gaze to the court clerk and nodded, signaling that it was time to proceed. The defendant's heart was racing. He knew that whatever decision the judge made next would change everything for him. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The judge had made her position clear. She wasn't going to let this arrogant man get away with anything. But what would she do next? What kind of sentence would she give him? The defendant's mind raced, but there was nothing he could do. He had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. The room was silent as the judge prepared to deliver her final decision. Everyone in the courtroom knew that whatever happened next would be unforgettable. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as the judge's words echoed in the defendant's mind. He had been confident, too confident, but now doubt began to creep in. His wealth, his power, his connections, None of those things seemed to matter here. The judge wasn't afraid of him, and it was starting to scare him. For the first time in the trial, the defendant felt vulnerable. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control. What could he do? He wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of this kind of treatment. People like him didn't face real consequences. Money and influence always found a way to fix things. He glanced around the courtroom, looking for a way out. But there was no one who could help him now. His lawyer sat quietly beside him, offering no comfort. The jury watched him closely, some with judgment in their eyes, others with curiosity. The judge, however, remained calm and focused, her eyes steady on him, waiting for him to respond. The defendant's hands began to sweat. He had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But now, facing a judge who was determined to stand her ground, he could feel the power slipping away. He had never been in a situation like this before, and it was becoming clear that he was losing his grip. He tried to shake off the unease, but the more he thought about it, the more desperate he became. What if the judge was serious? What if she really didn't care about his wealth? What if she was going to sentence him in a way that would ruin everything he had worked for? His reputation, his freedom, his entire future, it was all on the line. He leaned forward, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Your Honor, I apologize for my actions. I didn't mean any disrespect." His words felt empty, rehearsed. He had been arrogant earlier, but now he was pleading. This wasn't the confident, powerful man who had walked into the courtroom. This was a man realizing that he wasn't above the law. The judge didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. The defendant could feel the weight of her gaze, and for the first time, he began to realize that the consequences were real. There would be no way out this time. The silence stretched on, the tension thick in the air. His heart pounded in his chest. He had expected the judge to give him a chance to explain himself, to soften her stance. But she didn't move. She was letting him feel the consequences of his actions. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Desperation began to take over him. He knew that he couldn't undo what had been done, but he couldn't let it end like this. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm sorry. I've learned my lesson. I'll do anything to make it right." But the judge's calmness never wavered. She had heard his apology, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook just because he said the right words. It wasn't enough. The defendant had shown disrespect, not only to her but to the entire courtroom, and no amount of apology could change that. The defendant's mind raced, trying to figure out how to fix this. He had always been able to buy his way out of trouble, to use his influence to escape the consequences. But in this courtroom, none of that mattered. The law didn't care about how much money he had or who he knew. The only thing that mattered was justice. His thoughts were interrupted as the judge finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Hamilton, your apology is noted. But an apology alone does not erase your actions. You have shown the court that you believe you are above the law, and that is something I cannot overlook." The defendant's stomach sank. He had hoped that his desperate plea would be enough to sway the judge, but it wasn't. His arrogance had cost him everything. The judge had made her decision. There would be no easy way out for him this time. The room was still. Everyone waited for the judge to deliver her final sentence. The defendant's desperation had not been enough to change the outcome. He had pushed too far, and now he would have to face the consequences. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as everyone waited for the judge to deliver her decision. The defendant, once so confident and sure of himself, now sat with his head slightly bowed. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were not going to go his way. No amount of money, no fancy words could change what had already happened. He had crossed a line, and now he had to pay the price. The judge sat tall and still at her desk. Her expression was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper in her eyes, a strength that made it clear she wasn't afraid of delivering a tough sentence. She had been patient, giving the defendant every chance to show remorse. But now, it was time to move forward. The room was full of anticipation. Everyone knew that whatever she decided next would have a big impact on the defendant's life. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "Mr. Hamilton," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "you have shown complete disrespect for this court and for the law. Your actions have not only disrespected me as a judge, but they have also disrespected the justice system that everyone in this room relies on." The defendant sat up slightly, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. He had been trying to remain calm, but now his nerves were on edge. He had expected the judge to be harsh, but he still couldn't help the fear rising in his chest. The judge continued, "While I understand that everyone makes mistakes, what you've done goes beyond simple arrogance. You've ignored the rules that govern everyone in this country, and that is something I cannot allow to slide." The words were clear, but they cut deep. The defendant knew she was right. He had thought he was untouchable, but now he saw how wrong he had been. The judge paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before she made her final declaration. "Therefore, I am sentencing you to a period of community service, to be completed in full public view. You will work with those who have been affected by your actions. You will spend time learning what it means to be accountable, to show respect to others." The defendant's eyes widened in disbelief. Community service. This wasn't what he had expected at all. He had assumed he would face a fine or perhaps a brief jail sentence, something that wouldn't disrupt his life too much. But this was different. This was real, and it would make people see him for who he really was. The judge's voice remained firm. "In addition to community service, you will also be required to attend a series of lectures on ethics and respect for the law. This is not a punishment. It is a chance for you to understand the consequences of your actions and the importance of treating others with dignity." The defendant could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. The shock was written all over his face. This wasn't the easy way out. He would have to face real consequences, consequences that would follow him for a long time. There was no escaping the public humiliation he would face while completing the community service. The judge's gaze never left him. "I hope that this sentence will teach you that no one, no matter their status or wealth, is above the law. Respect is something that must be earned and given to everyone, no matter their race, background, or position in society." As the judge finished speaking, the defendant felt a cold chill run through him. He had hoped for a quick end to the trial, but now he realized that his arrogance had cost him more than he could have imagined. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, some in agreement with the judge's sentence, others in surprise. For the first time, the defendant understood what true power looked like. It wasn't about money or status. It was about accountability. And now, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The judge had made sure of that. The courtroom began to empty, but the defendant remained seated, unable to move. His life was about to change in ways he never expected, and all he could do was sit there, trying to process what had just happened. The day after the trial, the defendant found himself in a place he had never imagined, standing in front of a crowd of people, doing community service. It wasn't the kind of place a rich, powerful man like him should have been. He had always been the one giving orders, the one with the ability to change things, but now he was the one cleaning up trash on the side of the road, sweeping the floors of a local shelter, and helping the elderly at a community center. It was the first day of his sentence, and he already felt the weight of his humiliation. People walked by, glancing at him, recognizing him as the wealthy defendant from the trial. Some whispered to each other, while others stopped and stared. The once confident man who had commanded attention now found himself in the position of being looked down upon, and he didn't like it one bit. His pride had been shattered, and it felt like the whole world was watching him. His hands trembled as he worked, unsure of how to handle the embarrassment that washed over him with every glance from strangers. He had thought community service would be easy, something he could breeze through and move on with his life. But now, every moment of this punishment felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. As he worked, He couldn't help but think back to the trial. The judge's words still echoed in his mind. No one is above the law. It was a truth he had ignored for so long, but now it was impossible to escape. Every time he looked up and saw the people passing by, he was reminded of his arrogance and the lessons he was supposed to learn. He noticed how the people working alongside him treated him. Some gave him kind smiles and nodded, while others didn't even look in his direction. They were doing the same work as him, but they had done nothing to deserve the shame he now felt. He realized that he had been wrong all along. These people didn't care about his wealth, and his status didn't mean anything to them. They worked hard because they had to, not because they could buy their way out of responsibility. A part of him still wanted to fight it. He wanted to walk away, to leave this behind, and go back to his life of luxury. But another part of him, one that he had never listened to before, knew that he couldn't. He had to face this. He had to own up to the choices he had made and the damage he had caused with his arrogance. Over the next few days, things didn't get any easier. He woke up early every morning to report to his community service, dreading the long hours ahead. But slowly, something began to change. As he worked alongside the people he had once thought beneath him, he began to see their strength. He saw how hard they worked, how they gave everything to their communities, even when they had so little. They didn't need money to do good. They did it because they cared. The more time he spent doing the work, the more he understood. He saw how his actions had hurt the people around him, and how he had lived his life thinking that his wealth could shield him from the consequences of his behavior. But now, there was no escape. He was facing the truth, and it was hard to ignore. He thought about the judge and her sentence. At first, he had seen it as a punishment, a way for her to show him that he wasn't special. But now, he realized that it was a chance for him to change. The judge had given him this opportunity to learn and grow. And whether he liked it or not, he was learning something important. He was learning that respect had to be earned, that power didn't mean you could treat people however you wanted, and that the law applied to everyone. The public humiliation was just the beginning. The real lesson was unfolding before him, and it was one he couldn't escape. The defendant knew that his life was never going to be the same. He had been forced to see things from a new perspective, and it was something that would stay with him forever. As the days went by, the defendant's life began to change in ways he never expected. His community service had become a daily routine, and each day he felt less and less like the powerful, untouchable man he had once been. The work was exhausting, but it was the quiet moments between tasks that gave him the most to think about. For the first time in years, he had time to reflect on his actions and the choices he had made. One afternoon, while cleaning up the local park, he found himself sitting on a bench, taking a short break. Nearby, a group of children were playing, laughing, and enjoying their day. The defendant watched them for a moment, noticing how carefree and full of life they were. None of them cared about his wealth or his past. They were just happy to be together, playing and having fun. As he sat there, he started to think about his own life. He had spent so much time focusing on his money, his status, and his power that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had treated people like they were beneath him, thinking that because he had money, he was better than them. But now, surrounded by people who worked hard every day to make a difference, he saw how wrong he had been. The next morning, as he arrived for his community service, the defendant walked with a new sense of purpose. He greeted the others with a genuine smile, something he hadn't done in a long time. The people who had once seemed so different from him now felt like equals. He didn't need to be above them anymore. He had learned that being kind, working hard, and showing respect were far more valuable than wealth or status. His transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was real. The judge had given him a chance to change, and he had taken it. Slowly but surely, he had begun to understand the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their background or wealth. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he could make better choices moving forward. On the final day of his community service, The defendant stood before the judge once again. He had completed every hour of his sentence, and he had learned more than he had ever expected. His arrogance had been replaced with humility, and his sense of entitlement had been replaced with gratitude. He no longer felt like the man who had walked into that courtroom months ago. He was someone different, someone who understood the weight of his actions and the power of respect. The judge looked at him with calm eyes as she reviewed his progress. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, "I believe you have learned the lessons you needed to learn. You have completed your sentence, and I am confident that you will carry these lessons with you for the rest of your life." The defendant nodded, his heart full of gratitude. He had come to understand something that he had never fully grasped before. True power came not from money, but from the ability to change, to learn, and to treat others with respect. He knew he would never take that for granted again. As he left the courthouse that day, the defendant walked away not just with his freedom, but with a new sense of purpose. The lessons he had learned would stay with him forever, and he was determined to live the rest of his life with integrity, humility, and respect for everyone around him.